An empty locker, a stall with no nameplate above it in the players' area at the National Bank Open in Montreal, where Jannik Sinner's name was supposed to be. Next to it, another empty stall, Carlos Alcaraz's, then a third, Novak Djokovic's. Not a scheduling gap, not a minor absence the tournament could paper over with a press release, not a crisis anyone tried to hide. A hole at the top of the draw, 3 names deep, and a tournament director who decided to talk about it out loud instead of pretending it wasn't there. This is the story of a Masters event that lost its 2 biggest active draws back-to-back for the second year running, and instead of spinning it as fine, its own director stood up and said the sport has a real problem. Before we get to what she actually said, you need to understand something almost nobody watching the draw sheet this week has checked. The loudest version of this story, the one about a tournament shrugging off Sinner and Alcaraz and saying it does not need them, never came from the tournament. It came from 2 retired players on a podcast. The real quote from the person who runs the event says something very different, and the gap between those 2 versions is the whole story. Start with the mechanism, because without it, none of this makes sense. A Masters 1000 event sells tickets, sponsorships, and broadcast packages years in advance, priced against the assumption that the players ranked at the very top of the sport will be standing on that court. Ranking points at this level are mandatory for the top players under tour rules meant to guarantee stars show up. But mandatory participation has an escape hatch built into it. A verified injury or a withdrawal inside the window still counts against a player's commitment quota in only a limited way. And a top player managing a long season can time an absence to minimize the cost. The tournament still owes its broadcasters and sponsors the show. The players do not owe the tournament their bodies. That mismatch is the entire tension. So when Sinner withdrew, it was not framed as an emergency by his side at all. He has won 5 Masters 1000 titles already in 2026, 6 if you count back to the end of last season, an active streak that is one of the most dominant stretches at that level in years. Skipping Montreal to rest ahead of Cincinnati and the US Open reads from his side like simple math. Djokovic withdrew, citing the toll of a 5-hour quarterfinal against Auger-Aliassime at Wimbledon before he fell to Sinner in the semi-final, and at 39 years old, protecting the body ahead of another slam run is not a controversial call, it is the obvious one. Alcaraz's absence is the one with a longer shadow. The wrist issue that already cost him the entire grass season resurfaced, and this marks his 2nd straight year skipping the event. Sinner, Alcaraz, and Djokovic were not the only names missing. The withdrawal sheet across the men's and women's fields this fortnight ran into double figures, pulling in Jack Draper and Aryna Sabalenka too, which turns this from a coincidence into the pattern Tetreault described. 2 straight years. That repetition is what pushed tournament director Valerie Tetreault to go on the record instead of staying quiet. Her statement did not read like an organization insisting it does not need the sport's biggest names. It read like an institution naming a structural failure. We are obviously very disappointed that Jannik and Novak won't be joining us in Montreal this year, especially after they also withdrew from last year's tournament in Toronto, she said. That is not bravado. That is a director on record admitting the tournament is losing its headline attraction for the 2nd consecutive edition and does not consider that acceptable. She did not stop at disappointment. We respect their decisions and understand that with such a demanding schedule, players' health must remain the priority, she said, extending the players themselves the benefit of the doubt before turning the argument toward the calendar. That said, we believe the frequency of these last-minute withdrawals in the last few years raises a broader issue for our sport, she continued, which is a tournament director publicly stating that this is not one unlucky year, it is a pattern the sport has failed to fix. Masters 1000 events are among the flagship tournaments on the tour, and fans rightfully expect to see the world's best compete, she added before closing with the actual ask. We firmly believe adjustments are needed in the near future to better protect the integrity of our Masters 1000 events while remaining mindful of the realities players face. Tennis Canada, by her account, is already in conversation with the ATP about it. That is a tournament asking its own governing body for structural change in public by name. It is the opposite of indifference. Compare that to where the "they don't care" line actually originated. Former ATP player Sam Querrey, speaking on the podcast Nothing Major, argued bluntly that the tournaments do not care anymore and would rather bank 12 days of TV rights than protect the field. His co-host Steve Johnson, another former tour player, agreed with an edge of resignation, saying he wished it were a 7-day event because he did not believe the tournaments or the sponsors really cared. Those are two men who used to live inside this exact schedule, arguing that the extended 12-day Masters format has made the broadcast deal more valuable to the tournament than any single player's presence, so nobody with leverage fights for depth anymore. Tennis journalist Jose Morgado supplied the structural read that ties both versions together, pointing to the extended 12-day format as the mechanism forcing these withdrawals to stack up year after year, right in the exact window between Wimbledon and the US Open hardcourt swing where bodies are already worn down. So who headlines Montreal now that the top of the draw has been cleared out? Alexander Zverev steps into the role of top seed, a player who reached the Wimbledon final against Sinner this year and has spent a career being tennis's most consistent number 2 without becoming the story himself. Felix Auger-Aliassime headlines as the home favorite, a Canadian carrying an entire nation's attention in the building he grew up idolizing. The same player who took Djokovic to 5 hours at Wimbledon before the loss. Neither commands the pull of Sinner or Alcaraz. Both are handed the best opportunity of their season to prove the tournament's point for it. That depth can still sell a stadium even when star power walks away. Here's the verdict the sport actually has to sit with. This is not a tournament that decided it does not need its stars and said so with a shrug. This is a tournament that said, on the record, through the person who runs it, that it is losing them for the second year running and considers that a problem serious enough to take to the ATP. The confident, dismissive version of this story exists only on a podcast voiced by two men who no longer have to sell a single ticket. The tournament itself is not shrugging. It is the one institution in this entire story asking out loud for something to change. Because a Masters can survive one absence, it can survive two. What it cannot survive quietly is the moment its own director stops pretending the pattern is a coincidence.